They put me face down on hot asphalt in handcuffs while my Bronze Star was collecting dust on a shelf 40 miles away, and General Raymond Okafor's personal cell number sat memorized in the back of my mind like a loaded weapon I hadn't drawn yet. Officer Dale Briggs pressed his knee into my back, and in a voice that was almost bored, almost casual, he called me boy. 26 years of uniform, 2 combat tours, a meritorious service medal, and I was face down on the gravel shoulder of County Road 9 in Caldwell County, North Carolina, because 2 sheriff's deputies had decided that a black man driving home from his mother's house at 7 in the evening was suspicious enough to ruin. But here is what Briggs didn't know, and what Holt, standing 3 feet behind him, didn't know, and what the entire Caldwell County Sheriff's Department was about to learn at considerable personal cost. I wasn't just any black man on that road, and the call I was about to make from the holding cell of their substation would end both of their careers before sunrise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Marcus Webb, Colonel Marcus Webb, United States Army, though I'd stopped introducing myself that way since the retirement paperwork hit my desk the previous February, because 26 years is enough time to become a thing, and I was working on becoming a person again. The house in Caldwell County had been my mother's idea. After my father passed in 2019, she'd gotten quieter in the particular way of people who are conserving themselves for something important. And when I finally signed the separation papers, she said it the way she said most things. Plainly, without ceremony. The way a woman says something she's been waiting to say for a long time. Marcus, you should be closer. So I bought the old Hendricks place 2 miles outside Raleigh Hollow. A white farmhouse with a sagging porch and 40 acres of Carolina pine and a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the family that had lived there before me, of old wood and iron skillets and time. I spent the spring learning what retired meant. It was different than I expected. Better, in most ways. I'd spent 3 decades living inside structure, inside schedules, inside chain of command, inside the great grinding machinery of the United States Army. And I'd been good at it. Genuinely good. The kind of good that earns you real friends and real enemies and enough decorations to fill a shadow box you never quite know where to hang. Now the mornings were mine. I'd make coffee the slow way, the way that requires attention, and sit on that sagging porch with Gerald Hutchins' farm on my left and 40 acres of pine on my right and listen to the birds. Gerald was a retired schoolteacher who chewed tobacco and could name every bird in Caldwell County by sound alone. We'd been trading waves across the fence since April. My mother called every Sunday at 2. I drove to see her in person every other week. That was exactly where I was coming from on the Tuesday. Everything changed. We'd spent the Sunday the way we always did. Her pot roast, which she'd been making the same way for 50 years, thick with onions and rosemary and the particular patience of a woman who understood that good things require time. Old photographs spread across the kitchen table. The specific kind of conversation you can only have with someone who knows you better than you know yourself. The kind where silences mean as much as the words. And then, she'd done something she'd never done before. She'd gone to the bedroom and come back with a shoebox, worn at the corners and held together with a rubber band that had long since gone brittle, and she set it on the table between us without a word. My father's letters from Vietnam, 30 years of them, handwritten on whatever paper he could find, addressed to a young woman in Raleigh who would become my mother, who had never shown them to anyone. We sat at that kitchen table until the light went gold through the window, reading. I held those letters in my hands, thin paper, pencil faded, his handwriting looser than I remembered, and something in my chest did something I hadn't felt in a long time. By the time I got into my truck, it was past 7. The Carolina sky was doing that slow purple thing it does in September, that theatrical fade that my mother always said was God showing off, and I was 2 miles from home, and I was thinking about my father, and I was not thinking about anything that was coming. I was wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray Henley, my old University of Georgia cap, no rank, no uniform, no visible indicator that the man behind the wheel of the black F-150 was a retired colonel with a security clearance that wouldn't expire until 2029 and a direct line to the Pentagon. I was just a black man, driving through a mostly white county on a Tuesday evening. I had my registration in the glove box, my license in my wallet, my insurance card clipped to the visor. Both taillights worked. My speed was exactly the posted limit. I drove the way I'd driven for 26 years, with the kind of precision that becomes automatic when you spend enough time in environments where one mistake has real consequences. I saw the blue lights in my rearview mirror when I was approximately 2 miles from the Hendricks place. My hands tightened slightly on the wheel. I noted the tightening, acknowledged it, and released it. I pulled over, completely, immediately. Off the road, gravel shoulder, engine off, window down, both hands on the steering wheel in full view before the first officer had even finished getting out of his cruiser. I'd done this particular calculation before, Every black man who drives knows the math. The one who came to my window was young, mid-20s. Square jaw, the expression of a man who had recently been given a small amount of authority and was still figuring out what to do with it. His name tag said Briggs. The second officer stayed near the hood of the cruiser with his arms folded. His tag, which I would read later, said Holt. License and registration, Briggs said. No greeting, no explanation of why he'd pulled me over. No, "Good evening, sir." Nothing. I handed both documents over with slow, visible movements. He took them, glanced at them, and said, "Where are you headed tonight?" "Home," I said. 2 miles up this road." "And where are you coming from?" "My mother's house in Raleigh Hollow." He turned my license over in his hands. "This has a Fort Bragg address." "I recently relocated," I said. "Both documents are current and valid." He handed them back without comment. He stepped away. I watched him in the side mirror, talking to Holt in a low voice near the cruiser's hood, and for one moment I believed that was the end of it, that he'd run my plates, find nothing, wave me on, and drive away. I was wrong. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The first cold thing moved through me then. Not fear. Recognition. I'd been in enough situations in enough countries to know the difference between a thing that is over and a thing that is just beginning. "May I ask why?" I said. "Step out of the vehicle," he said again. The "sir" was gone this time. "I haven't been informed of the reason for the stop," I said. My voice was completely level. I was watching his hands. "I'd like to know the legal basis before I exit." Holt moved. I heard him on the gravel coming around the passenger side of the truck. He appeared at the window a moment later, one hand resting near his hip. Not on his holster. Near it. The way that is technically not a threat and is absolutely a threat. "We received a report," Briggs said, "of a vehicle matching this description driving erratically on County Road 9. We need you to step out." I drove that stretch twice a week. I drove it at exactly the speed limit in exactly my lane. The words "we received a report" did exactly the work they were designed to do. They created a paper justification where none existed. I understood what was happening. I'd understood it for the last 2 minutes. Understanding it didn't make it easier to stand in. "I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt and exit the vehicle," I said. "My movements will be slow." I got out, hands up instinctively, though no one had asked me to raise them. Briggs told me to put my hands on the roof. I put them on the roof. The metal was warm from the day's heat and the slight roughness of the paint caught my palms. Behind me I heard Holt open the passenger door. I heard him going through my glove box. I heard the papers rustling. My registration, the owner's manual, the napkins from the gas station last week. And I felt something hot move through my chest that I recognized as anger and that I locked down immediately, completely, the way you lock down a fire in a building you need to keep standing. "You don't have consent to search the vehicle," I said. Quiet, factual. "We have probable cause," Holt said from inside the cab. "What probable cause?" No answer. The glove box snapped shut. I heard him climb out, heard him walk to the back of the truck, heard him say something to Briggs I couldn't make out. Then Briggs came back to me. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to place your hands behind your back." I turned my head and looked at him directly. He was maybe 24 years old. There was something in his face I recognized. Not confidence exactly, but the expression of a man who has already decided on an outcome and doesn't want to be interrupted by anything inconvenient. I'd seen that face on young soldiers who made bad decisions in bad places. It never ended well. "On what grounds?" I said. "Obstruction of a lawful investigation." "I have not obstructed anything." I pulled over immediately, provided my documents, exited the vehicle calmly upon request, and complied with every instruction. "If you are placing me under arrest, I am invoking my right to remain silent and my right to an attorney." "Hands behind your back," he said. I put my hands behind my back. The handcuffs were cold. He clicked them on too tight, a degree of tightness that isn't accidental. And the steel edge caught the skin of my left wrist, and I felt the bite of it, and I made myself feel it completely. And then I set it aside, the way you set pain aside when pain is not the most important thing happening. They walked me to the cruiser. Holt opened the back door, and I folded myself into the hard plastic seat that smelled of stale coffee and whatever the previous occupant had tracked in on their shoes. The door closed. The blue lights were still going, painting the tree line red and blue, and through the back window I could see my truck sitting half on the gravel shoulder, dark and abandoned in the September evening, like evidence of a crime that had not been committed. Neither officer spoke to me. Briggs was in the passenger seat working on something on the mounted laptop. Holt drove. The cruiser moved onto the county road, and I sat with my hands cuffed behind me, and I breathed. 1, 2, 3. The way they taught us. The way you survive being in places you are not supposed to be, when panic is the one thing that guarantees you don't get out. My heart was going faster than I wanted. The cuffs had raised a line of pressure across both wrists, but my mind was doing something separate from my body. It was calm in the particular way of a mind that has identified the path forward and is already walking it. They had nothing. What they had was a traffic stop built on a fictional report, a warrantless search of my vehicle, and an arrest on an obstruction charge that had no foundation in law or in fact. I knew exactly what that was worth in court. I also knew something else, something that Briggs and Holt had not thought to calculate when they decided that the black man on County Road 9 was worth the trouble. I had General Raymond Okafor's direct cell phone number memorized. 2-star general, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, a man I'd eaten bad food with in Kandahar and who had presented me my colonel's eagles in a ceremony at Fort Bragg, while my mother sat in the front row in her good blue dress. Raymond took my calls. He'd been taking my calls for 20 years, and when Raymond Okafor made his own calls, people in Washington answered them. I had Captain Denise Carver's number. Now, Denise Carver, Esquire, one of the sharpest civil rights attorneys currently practicing in North Carolina. A JAG Corps veteran whose law school recommendation letter I'd written personally in 2018, and who had in the years since built a reputation for the kind of litigation that ended careers and changed departmental policy. And I had my brother Robert, 12 years a journalist, currently senior correspondent for a Charlotte network affiliate, a man who had once told me that the most dangerous thing in America wasn't a bad actor. It was a bad actor on camera. Robert had spent his entire career waiting for exactly this kind of story to walk through his door. They were going to give me one phone call. That's the law. One call. I had already decided which number I was dialing, and as the cruiser pulled into the substation parking lot and the engine cut off and the blue light stopped spinning, leaving us in the flat fluorescent glow of a rural sheriff's substation. At 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, that was still there, locked in a box, labeled and set aside. Something colder than anger, something more useful. I'd spent 26 years being very, very good at controlled demolition. Tonight was going to be no different. The building just looked different from the ones I was used to. The holding cell at the Caldwell County Sheriff's Substation smelled of industrial cleaner and something underneath it that the cleaner hadn't quite reached. A single fluorescent tube buzzed overhead with the persistence of an insect that doesn't understand it's already dead. There was a metal bench bolted to the wall, a drain in the floor, and a camera mounted in the corner behind thick, scratched plastic. I sat on the bench and I breathed and I looked at the drain and I thought about my father's letters, which were still in my truck, which was still on the shoulder of County Road 9. I thought about his handwriting. I thought about the particular looseness of it. A man writing quickly, writing in the field, writing to someone he wasn't sure he'd see again. I thought about that for a while. Then I thought about what I was going to do next. A young deputy, different from Briggs and Holt, someone who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable with the situation, brought me to the booking desk at 9:15. Briggs was behind the counter filling out paperwork. He didn't look up when I stood across from him. The charge, when he read it aloud, was obstruction of a law enforcement investigation and failure to comply, not resisting arrest, not anything that required physical force as a foundation, just obstruction and non-compliance. The charges you file when you have nothing but need something on paper to justify a set of handcuffs. You're entitled to one phone call, the young deputy said. He had the voice of someone who had decided not to have an opinion tonight. Thank you, I said. They handed me the receiver. I dialed from memory. It rang 4 times, which for Raymond was unusual. He was a man who answered his phone the way he answered everything, promptly and with full attention. On the 5th ring, he picked up. Webb, he said. Not a question. Just my name. The way he'd been saying it for 20 years. Raymond, I said, I need you to listen carefully. I've been arrested by the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department in North Carolina. No probable cause for the stop. No consent for the vehicle search. No legal basis for the charge. I am completely fine. I need 2 things from you. The first is that you call the Judge Advocate General's office and have someone reach Denise Carver in Chapel Hill tonight. The second is that you remember which congressman is on the Senate Armed Services Committee from North Carolina. There was a pause of approximately 2 seconds. In 20 years of knowing Raymond Okafor, I had never heard him pause more than 2 seconds before responding to anything. Marcus, he said, and his voice had shifted into something I recognized from command briefings. Flat. Very quiet. Very certain. Are you physically all right? I'm fine. You said Caldwell County. Caldwell County Sheriff's Substation, Deputies Briggs and Holt. I need Denise Carver. I'm pulling up her number right now, he said. I could hear him moving. Stay calm. Don't say anything else to anyone. I'll make the calls." Then before he hung up, "Marcus, I'm sorry this happened." "Don't be sorry yet," I said. "Get busy." The line went dead. I handed the receiver back to the young deputy. Briggs was still at the counter, still writing something, and I watched him for a moment and I said nothing. Because there was nothing to say yet, and because silence was doing more work in that room than any sentence I could construct. They put me back in the holding cell. I sat down on the metal bench and I waited, and while I waited I thought about Denise Carver. I'd written her recommendation letter on a Tuesday afternoon in a Fort Bragg office that smelled of old coffee and carpet cleaner, and I'd written it the same way I'd always tried to do things, without exaggeration, without performance, just as accurately as I knew how. Denise Carver is the most analytically gifted officer to have served under my command. She has the discipline of a career soldier and the instincts of a born litigator. The United States Army will lose something real when she goes into private practice, and the legal profession will gain something remarkable. I'd meant every word of it. She'd sent me a handwritten thank you note after her first major trial win, a wrongful termination case against a county police department in Durham. She'd won a settlement of $1.4 million. The note said, "I still think of you when I walk into a courtroom. Thank you for seeing it before I did." In the holding cell, with the fluorescent tube buzzing its tuneless drone above me, I allowed myself the precise and deliberate satisfaction of knowing exactly what was about to happen. It wasn't anger anymore. The anger had been appropriate, had served its purpose, and had been set aside. What replaced it was something I'd learned to recognize over 26 years of command. The cold, functional clarity of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The first call came at 11:43. I knew it had come because the atmosphere of the substation changed, the particular change of a building that has received information that rearranges everything. I heard Briggs's voice from somewhere beyond the cell door, and his voice was doing something I hadn't heard it do yet. It was rising slightly at the end of sentences. The questioning register. The register of a man who was suddenly unsure of the ground under him. Denise arrived at 12:21 in the morning. I heard her before I saw her. Heels on linoleum, a specific pace. The pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they have already determined the outcome, and haste would only make the other party feel as though they had more leverage than they did. The cell door opened, and there she was, 42 years old, natural hair pulled back, a dark blazer over a white shirt despite the hour, a leather briefcase that I recognized from the photo she'd sent when she'd made partner. She looked exactly like the officer who had once briefed a room full of senior personnel on the legal implications of a rules of engagement change and left every one of them feeling slightly less intelligent than when they'd walked in. "Colonel Webb," she said. Not because it was required, because she meant it. "Carver," I said. "Good of you to come." Raymond was very persuasive. She set the briefcase on the bench and clicked it open. "I need 10 minutes with you, and then I need 15 minutes with whoever made the arrest decision. After that, this stops being complicated." She looked up at me over the briefcase lid. "Are you hurt?" The cuffs were tight. She nodded. She was already writing. "I'll need you to show me your wrists." She took photographs. Quiet, methodical, the flash of her phone catching the red pressure marks that the steel had left on my skin. Then she sat across from me and asked me to tell her everything, from the moment I saw the blue lights to the moment they put me in this cell, and I told her, in the order it happened, with the precision of a man trained to report accurately under conditions that don't reward imprecision, and she wrote everything down without interrupting once. When I finished, she closed the notepad. "Let me go talk to Briggs," she said. "Carver." She paused at the door. Raymond mentioned the Senate Armed Services Committee. For the first time since she'd walked in, something that was almost a smile crossed her face. "He mentioned it to me, too," she said. "Senator Hargrove's chief of staff called the sheriff's personal cell 20 minutes ago." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm going to guess they didn't explain that when they brought you in tonight." Then she was gone, and I sat in the holding cell with its buzzing light and its drain, and for the first time since this had started, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first movement toward it. I heard the conversation happen in pieces, through the cell door and around corners. I couldn't make out most of the words, but I didn't need to. I could read it in the intervals, the long silences where Denise spoke and someone on the other end had nothing to say. The single short burst, Briggs, definitely Briggs, that was cut off cleanly in the middle, the quality of the quiet that followed. I'd sat in enough negotiations, enough command briefings, enough rooms where outcomes were being settled to know what capitulation sounds like when it's arriving. At 1:17 in the morning, the cell door opened again. It was the young deputy. He had the look of a man who has been asked to carry news he had no part in creating. "Mr. Webb," he said. He did not say, "Colonel." He would learn. "You're free to go." "On whose authority?" I said. He blinked. "The charges have been dropped." "I heard you," I said. "On whose authority?" The sheriff has reviewed the situation and determined that—" "The sheriff reviewed it," I said. I stood up slowly. My back ached from the metal bench. At 1 a.m, after the chief of staff to a United States senator called his personal cell, I looked at the deputy, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you are paying complete attention. "You're young," I said. "That's not an insult. I'm telling you that you are at the beginning of something, and what happens in the next few years matters. Watch what happens to Briggs and Holt. Learn the lesson they're about to learn." He said nothing. He held the door open, and I walked through it. Denise was in the outer room, standing at the counter. Briggs was there too. He was not behind the counter anymore. He was standing in front of it, to the side, in the posture of a man who has been repositioned against his will. He was looking at the floor. He did not look up when I walked in, and I did not look at him, because he had ceased to be the most interesting thing in the room. Denise handed me an envelope. "Your personal effects," she said. "Your truck has been moved to the substation parking lot. The keys are in the envelope." She handed me something else. A single sheet of paper, her letterhead at the top. "This is the formal notice of intent to file a Section 1983 civil rights claim against Caldwell County, the Sheriff's Department, and Deputies Briggs and Holt in their individual capacities. I had it prepared before I left the office." She held it at eye level for a moment as though reading something off it. "Deputy Briggs, this document was presented to your supervisor and has been entered into your personnel file as of tonight." Then she lowered it. "You'll be hearing from us." The room was very quiet. Somewhere a clock was ticking. The fluorescent lights of the substation outer room were brighter than the cell had been, and they caught the color in Briggs's face, which had gone through several things in the last few minutes and landed somewhere that looked like the particular white of understanding arriving too late. I looked at him once, one direct, complete look, and I said the only thing I had left to say to him. "I hope you learned something tonight," I said. "I genuinely do." Then I walked out the door into the September air. My truck was in the far corner of the parking lot. The night was cool and very clear, the kind of Carolina night that smells of pine and turned earth and the particular cleanness that comes after a day that has been warm and is now releasing its heat into the dark. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. My father's letters were in the glove box where Holt had left them. He'd touched them, I knew, had rifled through them looking for whatever justification he'd needed to find. And I opened the glove box and I took the shoebox out and I held it in my lap. The thin paper, the faded pencil. A man writing in a field to a woman he wasn't sure he'd see again. I started the truck. The next 3 months moved in a different register than any 3 months I'd lived through in uniform. The suit was filed on a Thursday. By Friday it had been picked up by 2 wire services because Robert, my brother Robert, with his 12 years and his network affiliate and his eye for the story that walks through the door, had written it the way he wrote everything. Clearly, with every relevant detail in the right order, with none of the sensationalism that would have let anyone dismiss it as partisan or agenda-driven. Just facts. Traffic stop on County Road 9. Colonel Marcus Webb, U.S. Army retired, Bronze Star, 26 years. No legal basis for the stop. No consent for the search. Charges of obstruction with no evidentiary foundation. Tight handcuffs and photographs of the marks. The charge dropped in the middle of the night after a United States Senator's office made a call. The story moved the way true stories move when they have enough specificity and enough documentation behind them, steadily and with gathering weight. By Monday, it was on 3 national outlets. By Wednesday, the Sheriff's Department had issued a statement that used the phrase, "reviewing our policies and procedures," which is the institutional equivalent of covering your face with your hands. By the following Monday, Briggs and Holt had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal affairs review. Their union filed a grievance. The grievance went nowhere, because Denise had something the union didn't. 90 minutes of dashcam footage from Holt's cruiser, which she'd subpoenaed within 48 hours of filing, and which showed precisely what I had described. A compliant driver, a warrantless search, and an arrest that could not survive contact with any objective reading of the Fourth Amendment. The IA review took 6 weeks. Denise sat in on every interview she was legally entitled to attend, and took notes on every one she wasn't. Raymond testified by video deposition to my character and service record. The young deputy, whose name turned out to be Davis, Marcus Davis, no relation, submitted a voluntary written account of what he had witnessed that night. He did it, I was told later, without being asked. I thought about what I'd said to him in the cell doorway and hoped it had meant something. The termination letters were issued on a Thursday. Briggs and Holt terminated without pension, with a finding of misconduct. The sheriff, whose name was Gerald Parrish, and who had spent 17 years in that office, announced 2 weeks later that he would not seek re-election. The Caldwell County Commission voted to fund implicit bias training for the entire department and to install dash cams with mandatory retention policies in every vehicle. These were not small things. I wanted to be clear about that. Then and now, these were not small things. They were, in the modest and achievable language of actual institutional change, real. The settlement came in February. $1.2 million, split as Denise and I had agreed. Half to a scholarship fund for black students entering law school in North Carolina, established in my father's name. The other half to a nonprofit that provides legal representation to people stopped without cause in rural counties. Because I had not been the first person pulled over on County Road 9 for the crime of being black in a mostly white county at 7 o'clock in the evening. And I knew it. And I wanted to do something about knowing it that would last longer than I would. The morning the settlement check cleared, I drove to my mother's house in Raleigh Hollow. She made coffee the slow way, the way that requires attention, and we sat at the kitchen table where we'd read my father's letters together in September. And the morning light came through the window the way it always did, unhurried and golden. And she wrapped her hands around her mug and looked at me with the expression she'd been wearing my entire life when she was about to say something that she'd been waiting to say for a long time. "Your father would be proud," she said. I looked at the shoebox on the counter. She'd kept it out since September, the way she kept things out when they'd been put away too long. Through the kitchen window, Gerald Hutchins's farm was coming up green in the early light, and the birds were doing what they did in the Carolina mornings, filling the quiet with the specific and patient business of living. "I know," I said. I picked up my coffee. It was exactly the right temperature. And for the first time since that Tuesday evening on County Road 9, since the blue lights in the mirror and the gravel under my boots and the cold metal of handcuffs clicked too tight, I felt the thing that had been locked down and set aside come loose in my chest. Not anger, not the cold clarity of strategy, but something older and quieter. Something that had my father's name on it. I drank the coffee. Outside, the birds kept singing, the morning held,